For various reasons, sometimes it's impossible to identify the actual registrant of a domain name before filing a cybersquatting complaint. Fortunately, domain name dispute policies such as the UDRP, the Uniform Domain Name Dispute Resolution Policy, allow trademark owners to file complaints against unknown registrants, although doing so may add a little extra time and effort to the typical UDRP case. Hi, I'm Doug Isenberg, an attorney and founder of GigaLaw, a law firm that helps clients protect their brands on the internet. In this video, I'm going to explain why a trademark owner might not be able to determine the identity of a domain name registrant, how UDRP service providers handle this issue, and what this all means for the UDRP process. The starting point for identifying the registrant of a domain name is what's called the Whois database, which is essentially a searchable collection of information about domain name registrations. For domain names covered by the UDRP, such as .com, .net, .org, and all of the so-called new GTLDs, or new generic top-level domains, every domain name registrar is required to collect certain details from its customers during the process of registering a domain name. Of course, one of these details is the name of the domain name registrant. Every registrar provides public access to its Whois database, so it's important to identify the relevant registrar for a domain name first, then conduct a Whois search on that registrar's website. Some of the largest registrars include such well-known companies as GoDaddy, 2Cows, Namecheap, Network Solutions, Enom, and Public Domain Registry. But there are literally hundreds of domain name registrars that are responsible for, as of right now, more than 366 million domain name registrations. When I first started advising my clients on domain name disputes in the mid-1990s, a Whois search was usually sufficient to identify a domain name registrant. But through the years, a number of complications have arisen. For example, plenty of cybersquatters simply don't provide accurate information when they register domain names, even though they're supposed to do so. As a result, the data in many Whois records is clearly inaccurate. A number of years ago, I filed a UDRP complaint against Barack Obama because that's who was listed as the registrant of a domain name that contained my client's trademark. Now, it was obvious that the President of the United States was not actually the registrant of the domain name, and I included a footnote to that effect in the complaint. In another UDRP case that I filed, the Whois record identified the registrant as SDF FDGG, which is apparently just a random set of characters typed on a keyboard. A second complicating issue when trying to identify the registrant of a disputed domain name is the rise of privacy and proxy services, which allow registrants to hide their identities from the Whois database. Services such as Domains By Proxy and WhoisGuard and Domain Privacy Protection are offered sometimes for a fee to domain name registrants who don't want to disclose their names or contact information publicly. Sometimes there are legitimate reasons for these services, such as when an individual understandably doesn't want to publish his or her home address, or when a company wants to secure a domain name for a new product before publicly announcing the name of the product. But these privacy services are also frequently used and abused by cybersquatters. Very often, cybersquatters use these services to hide their true identities, so trademark owners won't know who's behind a domain name registration, which can frustrate the UDRP process. But fortunately, as I'll discuss in just a minute, sometimes it's possible to lift the veil of privacy before or during the UDRP process. And finally, a third complicating issue when trying to identify the registrant of a disputed domain name is the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which arrived in May 2018. Because this regulation addresses the transfer of personal data outside the EU, it created new concerns about the Whois database and whether information in it should be redacted or access to it restricted. It's an issue that ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, has tried to tackle. But the bottom line is that, at least as of this recording, many domain name registrars have eliminated public access to a great deal of Whois data, or at least made gaining access to it more burdensome, which means the trademark owners very often encounter records with the names of domain name registrants withheld. Despite all of these challenges, the good news is that none of them prevents a trademark owner from filing a UDRP complaint. Although the UDRP rules require a trademark owner to provide the name of the domain name holder in its complaint, UDRP service providers recognize that this name is not always accurate or available, and as a result, they will typically allow a complaint to proceed based on whatever public information exists, which is why we have published decisions against such entities as Barack Obama or SDF, FDGG. Now, in earlier videos, I've talked about how I spend a lot of time researching and drafting UDRP complaints to be sure I've addressed all of the important factual and legal issues before I file anything. But in the case of unidentified domain name registrants, sometimes it's impossible to fully address this issue until after the UDRP complaint has been filed. When it comes to privacy and proxy services, some of them will respond to a request from a trademark owner before filing a UDRP complaint to disclose the identity of what they call the underlying registrant. Others disclose this information only after the UDRP complaint has been filed, and others never disclose it. In my practice, I very frequently file UDRP complaints against a privacy or proxy service only to receive a notice from the UDRP service provider that the registrar has identified the underlying registrant after the complaint was filed. The same thing is true for UDRP complaints filed against undisclosed registrants as a result of the GDPR. In the case of both privacy services and the GDPR, UDRP service providers such as WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, will typically invite a trademark owner to amend its complaint after an underlying registrant has been disclosed, either to identify the underlying registrant as a co-respondent, or in the case of privacy or proxy services, to replace the originally disclosed identity. This is something that a domain name attorney needs to be prepared to address quickly and correctly after filing. GDPR-related issues are treated in a similar manner. In a statement issued shortly after the GDPR went into effect, WIPO said that redactions do not impact filings. Specifically, WIPO wrote, "Much like cases filed today against a Whois privacy proxy service, if a UDRP complaint contains all available registrant information, where the respondent identified in the complaint matches the publicly identified registrant in the registrar's Whois database, such as name redacted, then such a complaint would be accepted by WIPO for processing and compliance review." In either case, it's important to note that this type of amendment has to be filed quickly, usually within 5 days, and doing so can have important implications on both substantive and procedural elements of the UDRP complaint. For example, learning the name of the underlying registrant may enable a trademark owner to strengthen its arguments on the UDRP's bad faith element by showing that the registrant has a history of cybersquatting. An amendment to a UDRP complaint may slow down the process or even add to the legal fees, but it's also something that a good domain name attorney can anticipate in advance and advise the client about upfront to avoid financial surprises. In any event, no matter what obstacles a cybersquatter may try to create, the trademark owner does not need to let any of these challenges prevent it from filing and successfully pursuing a domain name dispute. To learn more about domain name disputes, I invite you to take a look at other resources on my website at www.giga.law, where you can also subscribe to receive a daily email newsletter about important developments in internet law. Thank you.